And happy Tuesday, NCAA basketball fans. This is your weekly Trogcast, two really old guys talking NCAA basketball, and what a week it has been. The madness is in full tilt in the first weekend of the NCAAs. Before we get to that, we've got to say hello to the Trogs. This is Jeff Zink on this end, and my good friend Jim Reaker, the other truly old guy on the other end. Jim, just wow, huh? Wow.
Yeah, I kind of last week predicted that because of such a chaotic and mad year that maybe March is going to be a little bit calmer and we see things go by seeds. And remember, my Final Four was the 4 number 1 seeds, and obviously that got blown up real quick.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Lots of things happened on the first weekend, and you can look at it as very historic. A 16 seed fell to a 1. You knew it was going to happen sometime. Finally happened here, and you just got to wonder if there's more in tune. Last week, 2 number 1s fell out, 2 number 2s, 2 number 3s, 3 number 4s. So the whole bracket for people that are betting is discombobulated. But on the other hand, it's really not that out of whack. You've got 2 number 9s in there. You got 2 11s in there. But we'll talk more about how that's not that way. But let's talk first about some of the wild games from the first weekend. Which ones caught your eye?
Well, the first one that was really kind of a shocker was, I believe, Thursday night when the Arizona Wildcats, a team that you've kind of lauded all year out of the Pac-12, and a team that a lot of people with DeAndre Ayton and Lonzo Trier thought, man, this team, they got seeded low. They're number 4 seed. They probably should have been a 1 or 2. A lot of people said, who's going to stop this team? This might be Sean Miller's first national championship. And they don't make it past the tournament champion out of the MAC, the Buffalo Bulls. That was a shock come Friday morning. And I kind of watched some of the game, and what I could term that was Arizona seemed disinterested. And maybe the whole FBI probe and the things that have gone on with Sean Miller and the allegations that came out a couple weeks ago, maybe it just all got to Arizona, and maybe they were a team that was ready to be finished before it started. I don't know. But that was the first shock that I saw during the tournament.
Well, Pac-12 is one of my conferences, so I laud Arizona for being that team in the Pac-12. But the Pac-12 was so down, and they proved that first weekend, losing all 3 of their games, not going anywhere. That's not a surprise with the state of the Pac-12 this year. But I'm with you. They seem disinterested in it. And that would be a comment as we go around the table, whether it's Oklahoma or Missouri. It seemed like these stars that we hope to step up, and I said that too, like with Oklahoma and Trae Young and Michael Porter Jr. in Missouri. It would depend upon whether or not being in the NCAAs was important to them. And same with DeAndre Ayton, and probably even Lonzo Trier, that will probably move on from Arizona this year, as they speculated last year. It doesn't seem like the NCAA is an important thing to those types of one-and-doners unless you've got the people to pull you together, like a Mike Krzyzewski or a John Calipari, to move them to the next level. So that kind of caught up with Arizona. But we've said many times, Jim, that in this year, you got 68 teams in the tournament, but every week after week after week, we've watched upsets, and people go this way and people go that way. We often said there's probably 25, 30, maybe even 40 teams could win this. So, Buffalo, a bit of an upset. Of course, you've got to mention Virginia losing to Maryland, Baltimore County, which is the team that I mentioned, not thinking they would beat Virginia, but just to laud them for the way they've come back under Ryan Odom in the past couple of years. But not just that they beat Virginia, but they beat them by 20, and that's something that stands out to me that first weekend. Some of the massive beatdowns by good teams, and Arizona Buffalo was definitely one of those in the first round.
Well, a couple points. Number one, it just shocked me that before 9 o'clock Friday morning, DeAndre Ayton had declared for the NBA. So obviously, that was a priority to him. I think that said a lot right there.
He said it in the locker room after the loss.
Oh, maybe he said it at halftime. I don't know.
Yeah.
But you look at the Buffalo-Arizona game and the UMBC, even Virginia game. Here's the thing we have to remember. These are good teams. They've won their league. They've obviously played well at the end to win their league tournament. And remember, UMBC had to hit a three-pointer at the buzzer to win their tournament. But we also got to remember that these teams, they don't look at this tournament as in the big picture. They look at that one game. And if we can win that one game, that's kind of like their national championship, so to speak. Whereas the Blue Bloods, the Arizonas, the Michigan States, name, and who else was another big name that went down? Maybe not Ohio State so much, but who was, I think? Oh, North Carolina. I think sometimes they don't even look at those first couple games. They're already looking at, who are we going to meet in the Sweet 16? And I think that combination of a team that's playing for their lives, knowing that they're probably playing their last game, versus a team that might be looking down the road a little bit, I think that's what leads to some of these upsets. And the margin of victory, I think sometimes it's just you get to a point, and, in UMBC, in their case, I think it's just they played almost the perfect game. They probably could not have played a better game. And it was one of those things that just snowballed. I think Virginia just kept looking at each other like, when are we going to start hitting shots? Of course, they had a major they lost and you probably know, Hunter, I believe it was, their six-man, had an injury. He wasn't there. That may have led to, a little bit of, difference for them. But, I think it's just one of those nights. You have those days. Things weren't falling for the Wahoos, and everything went down, especially for the guy that really impressed me, Jarius Lyles. He had the game of his life. He was actually cramping up, but it seemed like everything he shot was going to find the bottom of the basket. So it was amazing, and it was one of those things. A lot of people our age said, "Well, it's got to happen sometime." Odds have it it's going to happen, but was it going to happen in our lifetimes? Well, it did, and it was amazing. You always thought it would be like a buzzer beater. That's how it would happen. That wasn't true for sure.
Yeah, and you got to also look at the depth of defense when you talk about UVA has won all year on their slow pace. The defensive often said defense wins championships, but you got to have an offense to go with it. And the other team that found that out was Cincinnati, who is the number 2 defense in the country. But let Nevada come back by 22 points. That's not the second best defense in the country for them to lose, even though they scored 73 in that loss. So it's a wide open tournament. Who were your fun teams? We mentioned a couple last week. Like I mentioned Loyola Chicago, to watch out for them, that they were in a position against Miami and Tennessee. They could get there. They needed 2 buzzer beaters to get there, and the prayers of the new folk hero, Sister Jean. But they are now in the Sweet 16, and they play a 7th seed to get to the Elite 8. Again, I've got to stick with that team since I picked them early. But were there teams like Loyola Chicago or somebody else that you just said, "Wow, this is fun to watch," whether in the first round or the second round or combined?
Well, I think Loyola Chicago is the darling now of the tournament. We do have a lot of higher seeds, but, number 11 Syracuse, well, we know Jim Boeheim and his zone defense is always, got a trick up his sleeve, and they can always come up and bite you with all the experience he's had coaching. And the other one, number 7, Texas A&M, we've said all year that they've underachieved and underperformed. They were a team that in the preseason everybody thought was going to be a great team. Had all kinds of issues during the season with some suspensions and some injuries. But I'll tell you, I did watch a lot of that game where they spanked North Carolina, and that's a team right there. If we're going to pick new Final Fours, I'm going to put in my Final Four coming out of the West region now. They are scary looking when they're playing like they're playing right now, and they're not playing like a number 7 seed. That's for sure. But, I think you got to look at Villanova and Kansas, who just took care of business, and got to be a couple teams that I think are going to be in the Final Four. that South bracket, I hate to say it, but it looks like, especially the way they're playing, that Kentucky is going to probably.
Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. That's one of the topics a little further down before we get to the Final Four. We got to talk about this weekend, and that's great stuff. And a lot of conferences still in it. When you look at it, let's just go through that really quick. You know, the ACC has 4 teams left in the Sweet 16, and they went 10-5 over the first 2 weekends. Big East has a team left, and they were just 5-5. The Big Ten, 6-2, and they have a team left. The SEC got 3 teams left. They were 8-6 in the tournament. Pac-12 disaster we've already talked about, 0-3 first round. And the Big 12 has got 4 teams left in it, and they went 8-3 over the 2 rounds. So the conferences, the big conferences, are still well represented, and then you've got your little smattering of the lesser ones, Gonzaga, Nevada, and Loyola Chicago in the lesser ones. The one thing that I would say before we move on to this weekend is it might not be as big of an upset as we're looking at. You know, when I went back and looked at the bracket, and I looked at the seeds, and in the first round, the higher seed won 23 out of the 32 games. So they were 23-9, but included in that were 3 9s beating 8 and 1 10 beating 7, and those aren't really upsets. So there, I think then in the second round is more, you know, it was 10-6, so a couple in there, but that included a 5 beating a 4 and a 3 beating a 6. So when you look at what's left, and this is leading us into this weekend, we got a 1 on a 5, a 3 on a 2, a 1 on a 5, a 2 on an 11, a 3 on a 7, a 4 on a 9, a 7 on an 11, and a 5 on a 9. So you take away that South that you were just talking about, there's really not that big of a discombobulation when it comes to upsets.
Yeah, things usually settle down by the second weekend, and I think you're going to see the higher seeds win most of these third-round Sweet 16 games. But I tend to agree with you. But it was exciting. But here's one other thing we maybe have to mention. I don't know what your thoughts are, but Sunday, what a dark day in Cincinnati sports history, our hometown.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, that just seems unreal that that'll never happen again. 1-2 seed from the same city, playing in the same city, going down back-to-back in similar fashion. Both had extensive leads and blew them down the stretch almost unimaginable. In fact, when it started happening in the second game, it almost felt like it was inevitable, like a train you couldn't stop, and it was like you wanted to turn away, but you knew what was going to happen. So it's going to be a day that you and I and probably almost every sports fan in this town will remember for forever, probably.
Well, to work on that, and we talk a lot about this on our Razorcast, and sadly we'll have our final one this Thursday now that the Xavier Musketeers are out. Xavier was lauded as probably being the weakest number 1 seed there. And 1-2 the first weekend shouldn't matter that much. They pounded Texas Southern, scoring the most points they had, so maybe they came into the Florida State game. But when we look at it, when we talk a lot about Xavier, and I know you're a big fan, they didn't really fare all that well against really top-notch teams and teams from other conferences. Now, Florida State played a heck of a game. They had Wiley Leonard Hamilton on the bench there, and I believe he's the oldest right now head coach in the tournament, and he's been around quite a bit, so he knows how to prep. It's still surprising, but you come with a Florida State coming out of a tough conference. That's not a huge loss. You would hope that Xavier went further. To me, Cincinnati was you're up 22 with 11 minutes left. That's just unexplainable how you lose a lead like that, being what they were, number 6 in the country. But like you said earlier, Nevada, they're playing for their life, but it seems Cincinnati just couldn't hold their poise. So yeah, a very dark day, but not a totally unexpected day. If we took a step back and talked about this, especially because Cincinnati, coming out of the AAC, we talked about that last week, and we don't know what they were going to be like. Houston won in the first round, lost in the second, sadly on a buzzer beater to Michigan. They could have made a run. And Wichita State upset in the first round to Marshall. So, they're there, but they just don't get the battle testing in the ACC the way Florida State does in their conference. And I think that for Xavier won out. In Nevada, Cincinnati just didn't come to play.
Yeah, no, Xavier's case, and we'll talk, I'm sure, more Thursday, but kind of the things that had haunted them a little bit all year, at times not taking care of the ball, playing sloppy. I think they had 18 turnovers. At times, or oftentimes, they just couldn't put their foot down when they had a team on the run and let teams back into games. Now, during the season, they usually pulled them out in the end. And, of course, in the last couple of weeks, we talked about the game at Providence and then the game against Florida State. Just didn't happen and kind of caught up with them. So, they were an offensive juggernaut, and sometimes you're not going to hit shots. Of course, Trayvon Blewett just had an off night, and you try to work your way through that. And, of course, it looked like McCura was going to be able to pull him through with his performance, but then him going out of the game on fouls was just I think that was the final nail in the coffin that led them to their demise. But again, we'll talk, I'm sure, more about
we'll talk a lot about that. We've talked often about the fact they escaped a lot of those games, and it was inevitably going to catch up to them. But let's talk about this weekend. Always fun, the first weekend where anybody can do anything. We've got going from, we'll have 8 games, and then that'll get us to the Elite Eight. We'll know the Final Four this time next week. We know we're going to have a seed as high as 7 in the Elite Eight because Nevada plays Loyola of Chicago, so one of those has got to go. But when you look through these 8 games, and that's Villanova, West Virginia, Texas Tech, Purdue, Kansas, Clemson, Syracuse, Duke, Michigan, Texas A&M, Florida State, Gonzaga, Loyola, Nevada, and Kansas State, UK. Which are the ones that we should be having on our radar that could be maybe title deciders?
Oh, well, I look at that Villanova-West Virginia game. You got to think if Villanova plays their game, they'll be victorious there. But West Virginia is dangerous with press Virginia. Bob Huggins and his defense. That's going to be a titanic matchup. Purdue's a little bit hurt. They lost, I think, Isaac Haas for the rest of the tournament, although they tried to rig up some contraption that they almost thought he was going to play, but he didn't. They're still a good team, but again, I don't think they're quite as tough without him, although the Harms backup, he played fairly well in their win over Butler. Texas Tech, of course, remember they were knocking at the door at the Big 12, trying to knock Kansas off that pedestal. I think again, Kansas, I don't think they have much trouble with Clemson. I see them getting to the Final Four. Duke and Syracuse, that's going to be a matchup of head coaches, Hall of Fame head coaches, and I wouldn't put it past Boeheim to upset the Dukies, although the Dukies look pretty good. Michigan, Texas A&M, that might be a game that decides who goes to the Final Four there. But, of course, I'm going to be watching that Loyola Chicago. I just love the underdog and the story, the human interest and all that, like the rest of the country. But, again, I think a game that really is going to be an important game is that Villanova-West Virginia game. That's going to be one I think you should try to watch, and that's a Friday evening game.
Mm-hmm. Well, if Bob Huggins is going to get back to his third Final Four, he's going to have to do something he's never done in the tournament, and that's beat a higher seed. And it could happen with that, but they're just very inconsistent, and Villanova's got that senior leadership. Still got guys on that club that won it 2 years ago. So revising things, but there are a lot of good matchups. I think a key one, you mentioned 6 of the 8 games somewhere along the line. Let's talk about 2 of the other ones you didn't mention. One is Kansas State and Kentucky. Kentucky seems to be peaking at the right time. Calipari's got all the horses pulling in the right direction, and he's in that South Conference where it's probably going to have to be Kansas State, who's jumped up and did a great job in their conference toward the end, but they were down in there. I can't see Nevada or Loyola Chicago taking Kentucky, so that's probably the game that will decide who's going to go to the Final Four if it's Kentucky. And the other one would be, the other number 9, Florida State and Gonzaga. Gonzaga just got to their first Final Four last year, and on the other side, you've got Texas A&M. I agree with you; it's hot at the right time, but they've been hot and cold. I mean, they can blow out of North Carolina one day and then lose by 20 the next, so you don't know what you're going to face. Michigan, who just got by Houston on a miracle last-second shot. So I think that those two brackets are going to be the most exciting, not necessarily the most interesting, because the other side of the bracket, they're closer to the seeds or to the powers, like you say, Syracuse. And Syracuse knocking out Michigan State. Neither of us really had Michigan State going that far. We've said all season that they're probably a little overrated for what it is, you particular, because you follow the Big Ten. But I kind of watch the Kentucky game and that Florida State-Gonzaga game to see who comes out of there, because that might decide who goes to San Antonio.
Yeah, and the other thing about that Kansas State-Kentucky game, that's going to be interesting because, as you mentioned, the way that it's played out, it played out pretty much the regular season, same way that the ACC and the Big 12 have the most teams left. They have, we've talked about, been the quality conferences all year long. And that's an interesting game because it's kind of the mid-level teams from both conferences going head-to-head there. So there'll be a little conference pride there, too, between the SEC and the Big 12. So it'll be interesting. I saw Kansas State out in Las Vegas, and they're very athletic. They really didn't have their act together. But, again, they played some great games in that Big 12, and that experience might pay off down the road here. But I think you're right that whoever's going to make the Final Four is probably going to be coming out of that game. Although you never know. You never know.
You never know. You never know.
Sister Jean, you looked at that second shot. Was there divine intervention? That ball hit the side of, and they were talking about it on ESPN. I think it was their coach said, 9 times out of 10 when that ball hits where it hits the glass and falls off on the side. It seemed to go straight up and back down through, and almost like there was an angel there tipping it in. Maybe Sister Jean has connections.
She does have connections. She was present when the Ramblers won their only NCAA title in 1963, and it's still there with them today. So she's evoking ghosts of the past. There's no doubt about it. And don't count out Purdue. The engineering department there, one of the best in the country, is working on some ways to get their big man arms back into the fold. And you got to remember, Purdue, this is a engineering department that helped put man on the moon. Neil Armstrong, Purdue graduate. So there's lots of things could happen there. But that's the nice thing about the Sweet 16 and going into the Elite Eight is these games you're not going to see, I don't think, many blowouts, maybe one out of the 8, and they're going to be tight, good games all the way around.
Yeah, you're right there. One last, because I did cover the Big Ten. The thing is, Purdue, they're a very talented team, even without Isaac Haas. They have the 2 Edwards boys, not related, but Vincent and Carson, who can both shoot. You got Dakota Mathias, who came up with a big shot in that game. So they're more talented beyond Isaac Haas. And again, the Harms boy, who's I believe he's from somewhere in Europe. He played a good game, and with the most minutes he's played all year, filled in well. So I wouldn't put it past Purdue making it at least to the Elite Eight. It's going to be tough again. Villanova's just playing well. So
and to get by a Texas Tech team that's come well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And throughout this thing, we have not mentioned Clemson, who put a beat down on Auburn, the SEC champ, and they could give Kansas fit. So we just don't know. That's why you got to play the games. But it's going to be fun Thursday and Friday as it was all weekend. We'll just have to see how they play out. So that'll give us a chance. Like we said, you started into it a little bit earlier, but now you had, if I recall, you said the top four, the top one seed. So you had Virginia, X, Kansas, and Nova going. And if we gave you a chance to revise those picks now, who would you go with?
I think I've already kind of mentioned, but I'll review Nova, Kansas. And again, if I had to pick a national champion right now, it'd be one of those two. But out of the other side, right now, I like Texas A&M, and pains me to say it, but UK, Kentucky.
You only do that because you have constant battles with UK fans. So that would be interesting. Out of those squads, I think Texas A&M is the only team that has not made a Final Four. There aren't many left that haven't. I don't think Clemson's ever been there, or Texas Tech, or Nevada. The rest of the teams have at least been to a Final Four, maybe not in their current iteration, but you also have a lot of coaches in there that have been to the Final Four or have won it. You got Krzyzewski, Boeheim, Self, Huggins, Wright, Calipari, all still there. Few, Hamilton has gotten. I think he got there not with Florida State, but with
Beeline.
Yeah, Beeline has been there as well in Michigan. So a lot of coaching strength as we go through. I said Nova in the beginning, and I'm sticking with that. And I had UVA going all the way, so I'm in trouble there. But I think Nova is going to get there. I haven't been a believer in Kansas the whole time. I picked Duke, and I'm going to stay with them. On the other side, it is tough. I think I'm with you. I've got to go with Kentucky in the South. I can't see any of those teams that are left beating Calipari and the group. But you got what might be more interesting is in the West, because you've got Florida State, Gonzaga, Michigan, Texas A&M. I think any one of those four teams could win it. That one, I think, more of a crapshoot than any of the others.
Wide open for what we're looking for.
Yeah, Gonzaga, went last year, so they've got that coming with them. Like I said, we got the Leonard Hamilton factor and Bayline factor. Just to be different, I'll say Michigan, because you've already taken Texas A&M, but I think whoever wins that game, if they don't come out too beat up, will be the team to go to San Antonio. So that's going to be very fun and interesting. And we'll know next week when we talk on one of our final Trogcasts. Only got two left. And next week to talk about the Final Four, and then by the time we talk on the following Tuesday, it will be the day after the championship game. So lots and lots of fun stuff. Well, you got anything else for us, Tim, before we go on to the trivia and tidbits?
Nope. It's going to be some good games again. Good time of year, but starting to transition to spring. If only Mother Nature, if somebody would send her a memo.
Well, I do believe that today is technically the first day of spring, but you will not be able to tell it by Cincinnati weather, that's for sure.
No. Somebody get a memo to Mother Nature. We need a little bit warmer temperatures.
Okay. Well, why don't you sit down and do that? Maybe you can talk to Sister Jean, and she can use her divine intervention. Okay. So what do you got?
I got a few things here, some trivia tidbits, First of all, here's one. Maybe you know, maybe you don't. Just pulled out of the archives. Do you know the only team that's played in a Final Four on their home floor?
That is a great question, and I would have no idea. I mean, you go back to 1939, so you've got almost 80 years of these.
And only one time. Now, teams have played
the Final Four, that's time, so that's 80 times 4, 320 teams. That's just about everybody in Division I. So I have absolutely no idea, but I'm sure you're about to.
Well, again, to qualify this, teams have played in their home city. Go back to Butler. The first time they went to the Final Four was played in Indianapolis, but not on their home floor. The only time a team has played a Final Four on their home floor was in 1959. The Louisville Cardinals played at Freedom Hall. That's where the Final Four was held that year. Unfortunately, they lost in the semifinals, I believe, to the Cal Bears that year, who went on to win the national championship. So that's my first one, but I got a few more for you, but these these are more, I guess, tidbits because they're pretty tough. I don't know if you'd know any of these. Talking about March Madness, do you know who coined the term the first time, March Madness, and what were they talking about? Because they were not talking about the NCAA tournament.
Oh, really? Because they would have said, what else was mad in March? Was it for a St. Patrick's Day parade or something? I don't know.
Man named H.V. Porter in 1939 wrote an article entitled March Madness, but he was talking about the Illinois High School State Championship.
Okay.
The first time it was used in regard to the NCAA tournament, historians believe, was sometime in the 1980s, and this CBS commentator was the first one to be credited to use it. Do you know who that was?
CBS commentator, could have been the great Vern Lundquist.
Good guess, no.
No. Then could it be Al McGuire?
Good guess, no.
Could it be Beano Cook?
Good guess, no.
Oh, no, not good guess. Beano Cook does football. I was just seeing if you even paid attention to him.
I'm not.
I don't know. Who?
Brent Musburger. Brent Musburger is supposedly, they think, the first one who used it on the air, referring to the NCAA tournament. But here's a couple other things that are interesting. The term the Sweet 16, which we are in right now and we use with the NCAA tournament, also is credited to the Kentucky High School tournament. They call that the final 16 that make it to Lexington, the Sweet 16. They're giving credit for that. And the term Final Four is attributed to the Indiana High School State Basketball Championship. And I got one more for you. I'll let you guess. I don't think you'll get this. But I'll tell you, it's a team we've talked about in trivia before. They have they're the answer to a lot of trivia questions. The first team to be called Cinderella in the NCAA tournament.
Oh, it's not as old as people think.
No, it's 1950.
1950. Okay, so it is
1950.
5-0 because you're cutting in and out, right? Okay.
1950. 5-0.
5-0. All right. I don't know. Was it for CCNY because they won that year?
You got it. That was the first time they think that a NCAA basketball team was referred to as Cinderella, of course, having that magical run till it strikes midnight. But, of course, and I believe that was the year they won both the NIT and the NCAA.
Yeah, it is. You are correct.
Small school out of New York City who will hold that title forever because you can't do that anymore.
No, can't do it. And then screwed themselves up with a point-shaving scandal just a couple years later. But we talked about both of those. Good stuff, as always. You have more?
No, I said, what do you have for us today?
Oh, okay. Well, a couple things. We got to send out a happy birthday to Bruce Pearl and pray that he never has to coach on his birthday again. His birthday was Sunday when he saw his Auburn team get pounded by Clemson, and he also had to play on his birthday about 7 years ago. I think it was 6, 7 years ago when he's still at Tennessee and got pounded in that tournament. So, Bruce, you might want to change your birthday or see what's going to happen there. We got some coaching changes. Lorenzo Romar, who moved from Washington, was on the bench in Arizona this year. Has been signed at Pepperdine. Tommy Smith out at Memphis after just 2 years and a 20-win season. And it's expected that today they will announce that former star Penny Hardaway will be stepping in. Virginia assistant Ron Sanchez has agreed to become the head coach at North Carolina Charlotte. That was the first coach knocked out this year, former NBA player Mark Price. And Kermit Davis has announced that he'll be moving from Middle Tennessee State to Ole Miss. And we also have Tom Crean, who is supposed to be signed there at Georgia Tech after Thad Matta decided to step out, even though they had a deal, decided he wanted to make sure his health was in good shape. And unfortunately, when we talk about Sister Jean, it's too bad that the Bearcats couldn't hold on because there would have been a lot of talk this week about the 1963 championship. because the Ramblers and the Bearcats were in that. Lots of history in that. It is the last time that a game was played in the same site 2 years in a row, and it's the same site as one of your trivia questions. That was in Freedom Hall in Louisville. In fact, Freedom Hall hosted 4 of 6 games in a row, so it must have been a very popular site back then.
When we were kids.
Oh, we were what? Yeah, very, very kiddie. That's it. So they had that. Third place went to Duke. Even though there were protests from state officials in Mississippi, Mississippi State went ahead and played because there were laws prohibited from integrated teams playing. This was in the Final Four, in the tournament. Loyola Chicago had the biggest victory, and it still stands, when they beat Tennessee Tech 111-42 in the first round game. A couple of things. It was Cincinnati's 5th straight Final Four, and Loyola Chicago kept them from becoming the first team to three-peat in an overtime victory. It was only the 3rd overtime game up to that point. There's only been 3 since 1963. And the Ramblers, like some teams here in this tournament, they had to rally from 15 down in that final game to beat the Bearcats. So near the Nevada thing.
Hey, I got a bonus trivia for you.
Well, let me finish with my stuff, and then you can bonus trivia all you want. Okay?
I'm sorry, but
yeah, that's all right. Like I said, Loyola Chicago is the only team from Illinois to win an NCAA basketball title. So like I said, Sister Jean was there, but it's a bit of a curse. Loyola Chicago, didn't have much success in the NCAA after that, and of course they just got to the dance for the first time since 1985. This year, Cincinnati wouldn't go back to the Final Four for almost 30 years. In 1992, they lost in the semifinal in Michigan, a win which has since vacated. So who knows? You don't get the claim that you would have moved up, so they might have played in the final game. And this is the big history, and people kind of bounce past this because of the Texas Western, now Texas El Paso. A couple of years later against Kentucky, they moved on. But this was the first title game where the majority of the starters were African American. 4 of the Loyola Chicago starters were African American. 3 UC starters were African American. So it's just too bad. I throw that out there. Otherwise, there would have been a lot of that on CBS this week. And like I said earlier, Sister Jean was at that championship game in Louisville over all that time, close to, what's that, 60? Not quite, 58 years ago, 55 years ago, something like that. I got to do my math real quick in the head. So what's your bonus trivia?
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but it clicked in my mind. I read this somewhere. Do you know where the name Ramblers comes from? Do you know what a Rambler is?
It's probably, it could be a car reference. It was a car.
Actually, it does not. It didn't even come from their basketball program. It came from their football program. Quite a while ago, I think actually in the 30s and 40s, their football program used to travel all over the country to play anybody and everybody who would play them. So they became known as the Ramblers because they rambled around the country and played everybody. That's where it comes from. If you see their mascot, it's actually a dog. But I think that when you have a name that you don't know what it is, everybody just comes up with a dog, right? Like, what is a Hoya? I don't even know what a Hoya is.
Hoya has to do with some things, the way they used to say things, so there isn't really a Hoya.
But again, they use a dog. So if you have a mascot, you don't know what it is, you have a dog.
You have a dog. It's like in my one of my former students who I always have the bet with every year because she's a Georgetown grad, and she couldn't even come up with that, but she teases me that Xavier should be called the fish because it's the only thing she could find that's a muskie. She doesn't know what a muskie is, and even though I've explained to her that it's a musketeer. Yeah, but hey,
the history behind that.
She's got to try to get behind it and get up whenever they want because we've pretty much spanked Georgetown since we've been making the bet.
Wasn't D'Artagnan the fourth musketeer?
According to the book, he was not he wasn't a musketeer. He went to be trained as a musketeer like his father, and that's when he ran into Porthos, Athos, and Aramis, and then he ended up becoming a musketeer. You are correct. The most famous of the Musketeers. Okay. Well, that's it for this week. We've got, listen in on our Razorcast. Sad end to what was a good season for the Muskies, but we will be talking about that on Thursday. We will be posting late due to scheduling issues between Jim and I, trying to find the perfect time when we can get together and talk about the Muskies. And then, of course, join us next Tuesday, where we will be able to talk about what we just talked about, except we'll already know what happened with the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8 leading into the Final Four. Okay. Anything else you want to add there, Jim, before we sign off?
Nope. Just hope our fans enjoy the games.
Yep. Fun stuff.